The reading is John 1, verses 43 to 51, headed Jesus Calls Philip and Nathanael. The next day Jesus decided to leave for Galilee. Finding Philip, he said to him, "Follow me." Philip, like Andrew and Peter, was from the town of Bethsaida. Philip found Nathanael and told him, "We have found the one Moses wrote about in the law, and about whom the prophets also wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." "Nazareth? Can anything good come from there?" Nathanael asked. "Come and see," said Philip. When Jesus saw Nathanael approaching, he said of him, "Here truly is an Israelite in whom there is no deceit." "How do you know me?" Nathanael asked. Jesus answered, "I saw you while you were still under the fig tree, before Philip called you." Then Nathanael declared, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Jesus said, "You believe because I told you I saw you under the fig tree. You will see greater things than that." He then added, "Very truly I tell you, you will see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man."
The two readings that we heard have something important in common. They both tell us that God knows each one of us personally, and that He's always with us and knows what we're thinking. Looking at a passage from John's Gospel first, as Nathanael approached, Jesus said, "Here truly is an Israelite in whom there is no deceit." Or in other words, Jesus described his character and how he thought, the sorts of things he would think. Nathanael replied, "How do you know me?" Which tells us two things. First, that Jesus' statement about him was correct, and second, that they hadn't met before, so there was no way that Jesus should have been able to know about him. But Jesus then takes things to the next level when he tells Nathanael that he'd seen him sat under a fig tree just before Philip had found him. And it's obvious from Nathanael's reaction, proclaiming that Jesus is the Son of God, that this was true, that he had been sitting under a fig tree. Now, if God knew Nathanael's nature and what he'd been doing, then we can be certain that he knows each one of us too, and what we're thinking. And he knows what each one of us says and does. Nathanael, from his reaction, was clearly surprised, a bit freaked out really by Jesus knowing what he'd been doing. And perhaps, I wonder if perhaps he's a bit embarrassed that Jesus might have heard him suggesting that nothing good could come from Nazareth, because Jesus was, of course, from Nazareth. It would be easy for us to feel uncomfortable too when we think about God being able to see us every second of the day. It'd be easy to imagine God watching us to make sure we don't do anything bad and misbehave. Like the police watching us on CCTV when we're walking through a town centre. But that's not what God is doing at all. So let's look at Psalm 139 now, which makes it much clearer. It starts by telling us that, as Nathanael discovered, God knows each one of us personally. And he knows our thoughts and what we say even before we've said it. And God knows what we do, when we sit and when we rise, when we go out and when we lie down. God sees everything we do. But the psalmist, probably King David, isn't worried about this apparent intrusion upon his privacy. In fact, quite the opposite. He regards it as really a very good thing, a great blessing. Listen to what the psalmist sings to God in verses 5 and 6. This is from the New Living Translation. "You go before me and follow me. You place your hand of blessing on my head. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too great for me to understand." So don't think of it as God watching you to catch you doing something wrong. Think of it as God being with each one of us, surrounding us with his love, taking care of us, guiding us. That really is wonderful to know, isn't it? Such knowledge too wonderful for me, too great to understand. It's a bit like when Kathy and I are looking after our grandchildren, which we can do because we're in a childcare bubble, I hasten to add. We constantly watch them and stay close to them. Now, we don't do this because we're trying to catch them doing something naughty so we can tell them off. No, of course not. We do it to keep them safe and to encourage them and help them to have a good time. We do it because we love them. This is the same reason that God watches us. To keep us safe, to encourage us, to make sure we have as good a time as possible, and because he loves us. Psalm 129 also makes it clear that God knows each one of us personally. He knows our character, he knows what you're thinking, what you're worried about, what your hopes are. Think how wonderful it is that God, the all-powerful creator of the universe, knows you as an individual, even better than you know yourself. How does God know you so well? God knows you that well because he made you. God knows you like an artist knows a picture he's painted. God knows you like an architect knows a building he's designed. God knows you like a programmer knows a software he's developed. And this tells us also that God made us as he meant us to be. Whether you're strong or weak, you're good at exams or academically challenged, you're able or you've got disabilities, it doesn't matter. Whatever, you are fearfully and wonderfully made by God, as the psalmist put it. Be assured that you are a perfect creation in God's sight. Now, I don't know about you, but I often don't feel like I'm a perfect creation. But always remember that God does see you as a perfect creation. And if God sees you as a perfect creation, then you should see yourself as a perfect creation too. The psalmist also sings that God is with him wherever he is. At first the psalmist makes it sound a bit menacing, as if he's trying to get away from God, but God's there wherever he goes. Wherever he goes, God finds him. But then when we get to verse 10, which says, "Even there your hand will guide me, your right hand will hold me fast," it's clear that the psalmist is praising God for always being with him, wherever he is. So always remember that wherever you are, whether you're at home or the other side of the world, God is with you. Even when you're in a dark place, surrounded by threats, or perhaps in a dark place mentally, then God is there with you. No amount of darkness can hide you from God. God's light shines into any darkness and will find you. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, then God's hand will guide you and hold you fast. Or as it's put in the New Living Translation, God's strength will support you. At this time in particular, when we're surrounded by fear, suffering and sadness, isn't it wonderful to know that God is with us, before us and behind us, leading us on and giving us strength? Isn't it wonderful to know that God has his hand upon you, blessing you? We're now going to look at the passage from John's Gospel again and look at it from a different point of view this time. We heard that Philip believed that Jesus is the Son of God, and he led Nathanael to believe as well. And isn't this what we all want to do as well, to lead our friends into a relationship with Jesus? Certainly I do. So let's see what we can learn from what happened. It didn't start well. Philip put up a good argument for Jesus being the Son of God, pointing to what the prophets foretold. But what did Nathanael say? Nazareth? Can anything good come from there? Nathanael obviously didn't believe what Philip had told him. And isn't this what happens so often when we tell our friends about Jesus? Like Philip, we put forward what we think is a great argument for there being a God who loves them and wants to save them. But then our friend, like Nathaniel, makes a flippant remark and clearly doesn't believe. Why don't they believe? It's because they've been blinded by the things of the world and so cannot see the truth. Even though the truth is so clear to us, it is blind. They are blinded to it. They cannot see the truth. But then Nathaniel very quickly changed his mind and proclaimed that Jesus is the Son of God. What made him change his mind? He changed his mind because Jesus described his character and said he's seen him sitting under a fig tree. As Jesus himself put it in verse 50, "You believe because I told you I saw you under a fig tree?" I imagine that Jesus was smiling when he said that, amused because he knew that if Nathaniel had been impressed by that, he was going to be absolutely amazed by what he's going to see over the next few years as he went with Jesus as his disciple. What does this teach us today about leading people to Jesus? It teaches us that if we tell them something about themselves that we couldn't possibly have known except by a supernatural method, then they will very quickly believe that there is a God, and they'll believe the truth about Jesus. Now you might be thinking that just because Jesus did this 2,000 years ago in the Holy Land, how can he be expected to do this today in Greater Manchester? If that's the case, what you need to remember is that Jesus was at that time a man. So he could not actually have seen Nathanael under the fig tree. But what happened is that our Father in heaven could see Nathanael, and he told Jesus through his Spirit, so that Jesus could tell Nathanael, so that he'd believe. And we also need to remember that God hasn't changed. The Holy Spirit hasn't changed. Our Father in heaven, who knows each one of us and sees what every single person does, says and thinks, still speaks to us through his Spirit, just as he spoke to his Son that day. So if you're struggling still struggling to believe that you could do this sort of thing, remember the words of Jesus in John 14 verse 12. "Whoever believes in me will do the works I have been doing, and they will do even greater things than these." This tells us that we can do whatever Jesus did, and even more, as incredible as it seems. Now, using what God tells us about someone really is a very effective way of leading people to Jesus. It's even got a name. It's called prophetic evangelism. I've read books and heard people talking about it, and it's wonderful how just the smallest bit of detail about someone can open up a conversation and end with that person turning to Jesus. But of course, we need to do our bit. We need to do three things. First, we need to listen to God speaking to us through his Spirit living in us. How often have I said that in the last few weeks? About needing to listen to God. It just keeps coming up. Perhaps that's not a coincidence. Perhaps God's really trying to tell us all that we need to listen to him at this time. Second, we need to recognise God's voice. This can often be the difficult bit. How do we know it's God's voice, not just our own little thought that's popped into our head, or perhaps even just our imagination? In my experience, God's words tend to come out of the blue, not part of a train of thought that we've been having. And I also find that I'm able to remember God's words better than my own thoughts. It's as if someone said it to me, which of course he has. Like most things, it does take practice, but the more often we recognise God's voice, the easier it becomes to trust that that's what we've heard. Third, you need to use this information that God has given you. It can take a lot of courage to go up to a stranger and tell them something personal about themselves and then start talking to them about Jesus. It's not easy. Don't pretend it is. But don't worry, because as we heard in the words of the psalm, God's strength will support you. Just be obedient to God and trust that he will give you the courage and the right words to say, and leave the rest to him. Just a word of warning though, God will never give you something to say that's judgmental or unloving. We're just talking here about a very small piece of information, perhaps maybe an illness or a bit of pain or suffering, or the reason they're upset about something, or perhaps just someone's name. That's all we're talking about here. So the question is, will you do your bit? Will you listen to God and use what he tells you to lead people to him, so that they too will understand that he knows them personally and is always with them, giving them strength and blessing them? In a moment we're going to say a prayer based on Psalm 139, but first we'll continue to remember that God is always with us to the words of our next song, You Never Let Go.